So friends, at this point we move to the second part of the story. There is actually no second part, because as Professor Payal Nagpal has said, that the story is built into a kind of a whole, a kind of a unity that appeals, at that level, at the collective level. So one can conveniently, draw a line oneself and say that now things are going to move in a certain direction. And we were left there in the first part, and now let's explore the possibilities of experience, the possibilities of expression, and the responses that through the character the writer gives to her world. So over to Professor Payal Nagpal, please.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. So we look at the third part where there is this, as mentioned, that it's just one whole story, but we are analyzing it in terms of these different areas. And so there is a dinner that's there at the house of Bertha and Harry Young, and people from different sections of the society are present. There are the Norman Knights, a couple, and then there is a young poet, Eddie Warren, and a find of Bertha's, Pearl Fulton. Now Bertha is very drawn to Pearl Fulton, and as Mansfield writes, and a find of Bertha's called Pearl Fulton. What Miss Fulton did, Bertha didn't know. They had met at the club, and Bertha had fallen in love with her, as she always did fall in love with beautiful women who had something strange about them. So here I think the subtext is extremely pronounced, which is why this is also an early story that it is an expression of possible homoerotic love between Bertha and Pearl. So, but as mentioned, that this expectation is, of course, towards the end there is a transition that takes place. And so she is very drawn towards, and with great ease, I think also because Mansfield, probably there's consciousness of the ending, that with great ease she mentions how these two women had met at the club and how Bertha was completely in love with her. So there is this intense camaraderie as far as Bertha is concerned. What Pearl Fulton thinks about this, we really don't know. We know all this through Bertha's psyche. So this is very, very important, and this the subtext here of the many Berthas. We've looked at one Bertha who's in a state of bliss in matrimony. There is another Bertha who's waiting for something to happen, and now there is a Bertha who's very drawn towards other women. So and here we move to the symbolism of what is called the pear tree. It's intriguing that Virginia Woolf found the conception of the story to be poor, but she found the vision, however imperfect, of an interesting mind. And Todd Martin, in reviewing a book on Katherine Mansfield, says that Mansfield's choice of the short story as her primary mode of writing further relegated her to the margins of modernism, possibly because the genre of the novel took over. But by the same token, Todd says that Kaplan argues that Mansfield's choice of the genre reveals her evolution as a modernist, for the short story provided her with a degree of flexibility that allowed her to undermine conventions more easily. So we have a lot of ideas packed here. One, that Mansfield wrote a lot of short stories, and is it possible, for this reason that she was probably on the margins, because the writing of the novel, long fiction in that sense, was the primary mode. And Todd Martin is talking about this while reviewing a book on Katherine Mansfield by Kaplan. So, but at the same time, the writing of the short story gives her a certain kind of flexibility that allows her to undermine convention. So I think the very factor of matrimony and heterosexuality is completely undermined here, and this flexibility is what she gets in a sense through the short story. So Mansfield was interested in representing life, but she used the form of the short story to allow her to attribute symbolic meaning to the realistic events she portrayed. Kaplan also shows how Mansfield uses free indirect style to emphasize the interiority of her characters, which is developed through the use of sensory impressions. So two very important factors, that there are ordinary day-to-day events, but there is an intense symbolism, as discussed, that has come in through the use of color, the way in which her own psyche works. There is a certain sense of an intense layered movement that's built into the story. So, for instance, the windows of the drawing room opened onto a balcony overlooking the garden, and it is in this context that we have the symbolism of the pear tree. And there are very divergent opinions about the pear tree, and we'll come to this. So the windows of the drawing room open onto a balcony. One is also reminded of Kate Chopin's story that we discussed in an earlier lecture, where the protagonist is looking outside of the room into the garden. And so the window, in a sense, I think carries intense symbolism here, as does the garden. So at the far end, against the wall, there was a tall, slender pear tree in fullest, richest bloom. It stood perfect, as though becalmed against the jade green sky. So there's a pear tree, it's full, it's perfect. Bertha couldn't help feeling, even from this distance, that it had not a single bud or a faded petal. Now, here we have two very, very contradictory, ideas that can be very easily missed. So, the first tells us that it's a pear tree that's full, that's rich, it's in bloom. However, in this bloom, there is not a single bud or a faded petal. And down below in the garden beds, the red and yellow tulips, heavy with flowers, seem to lean upon the dusk. So, the smaller flowers are heavy, the smaller ones are heavy with flowers, but there is nothing on this pear tree. And in fact, what we have in sharp contrast to all this is a grey cat dragging its belly, and the sight of all this is so intent and quick that Bertha she experiences a curious shiver. There is something very, very inexplicable that's happening here. There is the symbolism of the pear tree. How do we interpret this pear tree? Do we look at the pear tree as signifying full bloom, or do we look at the pear tree as something that's completely almost sterile, because it does not have any of these, the flowers are not there, the faded petals are not there. In fact, the pear tree, in a sense, is also symbolic of the two different Berthas here. One who's in the state of bliss and one who experiences a certain lack. The dragging of the cats, indicative of course, sexual references, and Bertha finds them very, very creepy, and this is possibly a reaction to her own intimacy, in a sense, with Harry, that leads her to say what creepy things cats are, and she just turns away from the window. The sight of the cat puts her off, and she moves away from this window. So she considers her life to be like the pear tree, that's full, that's happy, and she tells herself, I'm too happy, I'm too happy. And she seemed to see on her eyelids a lovely pear tree. Now here I'd again request Professor Prakash what he really thinks of the way in which the symbolism of the pear tree is built.
Well, the way you have presented it raises many questions. One question would be, as you rightly pointed out in the beginning, is the difference from the novel, long fiction and the short fiction. And in the long fiction, you have to give more details, and you have to also analyze things, compare and contrast, and you have to make a statement. In the short fiction mode, you can talk, not about these things at all, but only about impressions. And short fiction, that way takes away from the larger depiction of life. So that being said, then when there's so much going on, churning in the mind of the writer and the characters through her, then that can be said not through statements at all. So one has to pick up, as you very distinctly point out, the presence of symbols there, and those symbols are sometimes static, sometimes they tell things which are different. And I think very, very well you pointed out that behind this symbolism actually stands a woman who is reacting to the banal ways in which she can interact with her husband, and she finds more fulfillment, more bliss, to use the word, with her connection and her approach to the other woman. And I have to raise this particular question from you because you have read the story very deeply. Is there some specific difference that is there between Bertha and Miss Fulton, or that one is the replication of the other?
No, no, one is certainly not the replication of the other. And the two women, whatever's kind of, there is a moment in the story that Bertha looks for, where she gets a moment to interact silently with Miss Fulton. But the ending of the story presents a different Pearl Fulton to us. One who's more involved with Harry than she is, with
There's a third
Bertha.
angle.
That's the angle.
Oh,
that turns the story completely on its head. So here, we look at Bertha constantly saying that she had everything, she was young. Harry and she were as much in love as ever, and they got on together splendidly. And she says something very interesting about this marriage, that they were really good pals. And she had an adorable baby, no worry about money, satisfactory house, garden, friends, thrilling friends. They interact with writers and painters and poets. So, everything, they have everything going for them. And we all know that this state of bliss is a cover, it's hiding something. And it's very, there is something amiss. But the story does not really, one has to read this main text always in the context of the subtext to know that, for instance, when she thinks about, there is a moment when she imagines that she is going to be finally with Harry when all these guests have left, and she finds that moment to be a scary moment. So it's these words that are just, I think, put there by the writer that provide us with another perspective to Bertha and to this marriage. So she thinks that the thought of being alone in a dark room with Harry appears very strange and terrifying to her. And there is a sense of the uncertain. She does not know what it could be. And of course, Harry passes a lot of these snide remarks about Pearl Fulton, almost indicating that he does not consider her to be much. So, but Bertha looks for that moment, in this party where she can stand and just be with Pearl. So, but Bertha knew, and I'm just quoting from the story, but Bertha knew suddenly, as if the longest, most intimate look had passed between them. As if they had...
Between the husband and Fulton?
No, between Pearl and Bertha.
Okay.
As if they had said to each other, you too. That Pearl Fulton, stirring the beautiful red soup in the grey plate, was feeling just what she was feeling. And Bertha continues to, of course, beyond this moment intervenes. It's an intervention into the blissful life, where she's constantly looking for Harry's affirmation, his compliments. There is almost a point where she says that if he were to say that the souffle is admirable, then she would have wept with childlike pleasure. So and this moment that she has when both of them are standing together and looking at the garden. So she says that I believe this does happen very rarely between women, but never between men, she thinks. And so she looks for that moment, and Miss Fulton gave the sign. Have you a garden, is what she asks. And so she crossed the room, pulled the curtains apart, and the two women stood side by side looking at the slender flowering tree. Although it was so still, it seemed like the flame of a candle to stretch up, to point, to quiver in the bright air. Now this pear tree presents a new moment to the reader, where the two women are standing side by side and looking at the flowering tree. We know what Bertha is looking at. We don't know what Pearl Fulton is looking at. She's looking at the tree, but what is she thinking is not available to us.
This ignorance, this lack of knowledge is something that is indicated in the beginning of the story, that there's something else is coming? And
well, yes. What it is we don't know, but there is a sense, because there is so much of bliss that is projected, that one almost knows that this, bliss is going to be an illusion. So, they both are, standing and watching, looking at the pear tree, and this is what Bertha thinks, that they understand each other perfectly, they are creatures of another world, and there is a blissful treasure that burned in their bosoms and dropped in silver flowers from their hair and hands. And silver is used in connection with Pearl Fulton, not only in the name but also in some of the things that she's wearing in her hair. So she thinks that Harry does not like Pearl, and she thinks it's her job is to almost convince Harry that Pearl is very, very close to her, and how she must really appreciate he must really appreciate Pearl. And it is at this moment there is a sense of desire that Bertha experiences, and she thinks about her husband. However, this moment of desire has come immediately after the moment that she has shared with Pearl Fulton, and so it is not really, I think the two things are juxtaposed against each other for the reader to really think about how the subtext of homoerotic love is extremely important in this particular story. So it's clearly said for the first time, it's after this moment that the two watch the tree together, that she desired Harry. So here it is, and this is just suddenly undercut. Eddie Warren is supposed to be the poet, and suddenly comes up and undercuts her train of thoughts as he says that must it always be tomato soup, and tomato soup is so dreadfully eternal. And one wonders what's really happening here. Suddenly, from the intensely sensual, one is just brought to the very mundane and the ordinary. It's almost like just falling on the floor. So Pearl Fulton, as she's going out, murmurs, your lovely pear tree. It and it is here that she is privy, Bertha Young is privy to a moment between Harry and Pearl, where she gets to know that Harry is probably seeing Pearl Fulton. So she catches them in an embrace, and of course they are not aware, and she is privy to this, and that completely turns the story on its head. And where Bertha had really speaking looked towards Pearl, now this new equation that has emerged completely catches her off guard, and she really speaking does not know how to deal with it. So it's almost ironic when Pearl Fulton murmurs, your lovely pear tree, almost indicating that the pear tree that she considers to be so full and representative of marriage, I think that expectation is clearly done away with. We also need to ask here as to why Katherine Mansfield gives it this kind of ending, and it's important, it's significant to ask this question, because I think the times were such that it was important probably to have an ending that did not make the subtext the text and let it remain at that particular level. So if we look at the last lines in the story, your lovely pear tree, Bertha simply ran over to the long window, and she cries and she asks a question, oh, what is going to happen now? But the pear tree was as lovely as ever, and as full of flowers, and as still. So the pear tree remains where it is, but Bertha suddenly has no answers as to what, really speaking, her own situation is going to be.
You see, my question to this kind of analysis would be that perhaps it's not a modernist story. It's a story that says something positive about an alternative angle. And that angle is missing in modernism. Modernism is basically vacuous and dull and dry, drab, and sometimes bitter. And here is an assertion of a different kind of situation and emotion.
So, which is why right at the beginning I felt that one has understood modernism primarily from a certain kind of canonical understanding of modernism. After all, even playwrights like Bertolt Brecht is also writing, pretty much in the 20s onwards, 30s, and so on. So, similarly, when we look at short story writers like Katherine Mansfield, I think she uses the tropes of modernism, of symbolism, of an intense layering, of building a kind of sensuousness of looking at, the interior monologue of the protagonist, of
and
not
saying so
having
many
an
things
ending.
positive, so
Yes.
many things fulfilling.
Yes. So I think that in a sense holds a certain, I don't know if it undercuts the canonical understanding of modernism, but holds a new dialogue, I think, with our understanding of modernism.
There is a kind of alienation here, but that alienation is so positive, and
Yes.
unlike in modernism,
Yes.
where the person is self-alienated, here the self is split into two parts, and those parts coalesce also at many points of time.
Yes. So there is a moment in the story where in her marriage it is projected that she is cold and she's frigid, but which is why I think we need to go back to the episode of her interaction with her daughter, because that moment, the kind of affection that she showers on the child and asserts herself and says that, as per behavior and conduct manuals and so on, she's not supposed to be doing what she's doing, but she chooses to feed the baby, she chooses to, hold her, and the nanny is not very happy about it and says that no, the child should only be in one set of hands.
How do you explain unto yourself and to the viewers, the importance of motherhood that you have emphasized at some point of time in the discussion?
I think the importance of motherhood here lies in the fact that the kind of frigidity that she's associated with in her marriage vis-a-vis Harry, I think one needs to first of all challenge it through her role as a mother, and secondly also in her sentiments towards other women. So obviously within a heterosexual structure she's a misfit, and Mansfield has clearly told us about how she appreciates other women. So but I think the answer also lies in an understanding of the pear tree here, and here Nebuchadnezzar says something very important. Nebuchadnezzar says that thus a pear tree in perfect bloom may be sterile, and this is about because a pear tree is a bisexual tree, so it may be sterile, unable to bear fruit without a single bud or a faded petal. Even as it symbolizes perfection, it is in essence incomplete, beautiful and non-functional. So I think the state of bliss of a heterosexual relationship, of matrimony, is the pear tree, but it is incomplete because her own desires, which is all the subtext, lie elsewhere, and which is why again the ending of the story, and at one point Katherine Mansfield herself in one of her journals has written that one can get only so much into a story. There is always a sacrifice. One has to leave out what one knows and longs to use. Why? I haven't any idea, but there it is. It's always a kind of race to get in as much as one can before it disappears. So I think the subtext has to be kind of sacrificed here. It is important for that to happen given the times and given the nature of the subtext. So, but the bliss in this sense is completely belied at all levels, I think. The pear tree stands the way it is, projecting things the way they are, because pretty much Bertha Young stands within her marriage, and but there is a deep sense of lack that this projection of bliss has brought out.
So bliss has come and gone.
Yes.
It was there, she enjoyed it, but at a certain point of time, the bliss became unreal, and finally it disappears.
It disappears.
That's a very fine conclusion of the story, isn't it?
Yes, and I think that there is great value in what she is writing, not only because of the themes that she is taking up, but also because of her narrative technique, the style, the use of symbols, and the fact that we have to look at the fact that it's a woman who is writing, and is her writing any different from what precedes and what is being written at that point of time. The comparison has always been with Virginia Woolf, but I think their styles are very distinctly different. What do you think about comparison between, let's say, Virginia Woolf and Katherine Mansfield?
See, I was just wondering about this as you were explaining the story, and I thought that Virginia Woolf is not able to take away from the war situation First World War is behind both the writers, and this writer is totally immersed in her own self, and she doesn't think that a situation like the war exists. So maybe that's one thing, no?
Yes, absolutely, because this is one of the, if critique one can call it, of her writing, that, she seems to be unaware. But I think this is where her strength lies. She chooses to talk about issues, I mean, she might not be writing about the suffragette movement.
Which are humanistic,
Exactly.
which are positive.
Yes, yes.
Where the search, will take you somewhere.
And I think the very statement where there is a cry at the end about, what is going to happen now, is a realization that the bliss was illusory. Be it the marital bliss or the moment that was there. It's almost as if suddenly there is a realization of being alone. So I think that is very crucial to the story, and the ending completely turns the story on its head. So
please comment on the ending.
So if we look at the ending of the story, the idea of bliss that's built up in the story is taken away, and I think what is projected as one of the possible answers to what will really happen now is that this idea of bliss is something that a woman like Bertha has to locate within her own life and build up the self that is not subject to the illusory bliss that matrimony, really speaking, offers. And I think this is a moment of strength and not breakdown, where she's possibly going to be compelled to think about it, as at least the reader will be compelled to think about what really are the alternatives in front of a woman like Bertha Young. So the bliss that is built up is completely belied here, and the idea is the genuine bliss needs to be sought. So
I think that's a fairly well-reasoned ending of the discussion. We start from the bliss as a positive aspect, and towards the end all possibilities of goodness or positive thing have been exhausted, and yet it leads us to a place where a kind of relationship will finally remain valuable. So with this conclusion kind of a thing, and thank you, Professor Nagpal, we end the discussion, and I think there is a lot that can be considered, viewers, by yourself in your own minds, and just see how the 20th century appeared to these writers as positive as well as questionable. Thank you.